Rocky Mountains. Winter, 1887. A heavy-set woman alone in a frozen gully scraping ruined flour off the ground and eating it. Not from hunger, because the baby inside her coat needed her body warm enough to keep him alive one more hour. That's what her husband left behind on the road. Then iron wheels on stone. A man stopped. No questions. He just looked at her, really looked, the way nobody had in years, and lifted her onto the wagon like she'd never been anyone's burden. But on that mountain pass, teetering over a sheer drop in a blizzard, the very weight her husband called too much was the only thing that pulled the wagon back from the edge. That was just the first night. This is the story of a woman left for dead and the mountain man who found her. Follow along so you don't miss a single chapter. The flour was already ruined. Abby knew that. She'd known it since the sack split open against the frozen ground, since the white powder mixed with gray slush and turned to paste between her fingers. But she scraped at it anyway, packed it against her tongue, swallowed the grit and the cold and the shame of it all. Because shame didn't kill you. Freezing did. The baby hadn't made a sound in a while. That scared her more than anything. She pressed her palm flat against the bundle inside her coat, felt the faint rise and fall against her ribs. Wyatt was still breathing, same as he'd been, since the day he came into the world, and her sister left it. She pulled the coat tighter around him, tucking the wool flap beneath her arm, sealing in whatever warmth her body still held, and her body held more than most. She'd been told that her whole life, in every way, people knew how to say it, without being kind about it. Too much, too large, too heavy for the wagon, too expensive to feed, too much trouble for a man who'd promised her a future and delivered her a death sentence instead. You're slowing us down, Abigail. Every mile, those wheels dig deeper because of you. Josiah had said it on the third day out of Cheyenne, when the trail climbed and the horses strained. He'd said other things after that. Meaner things. Things she didn't let herself replay now, because she needed every piece of her mind for surviving, not for grieving. He'd stopped the wagon on a wide, flat stretch of nothing, told her to get down and stretch her legs. Then he'd clicked his tongue at the horses and kept going. She'd stood there in the road and watched the wagon get smaller, waited for him to stop, to turn around, to feel something. He didn't. That was 3 days ago, maybe 4. Time had gone strange on her since the blizzard rolled in. She'd walked until her boots soaked through, found a shallow gully out of the wind, and done what she knew how to do. She survived. She pulled spruce boughs for insulation. She kept moving when the cold told her to lie down. She ate the flour even after the sack split because calories were calories, and her body was still working, still burning, still keeping Wyatt alive inside that coat. She was so tired. Her fingers were past the point of hurting. That was bad. She knew frostbite from stories her father told. First the pain leaves, then the color, then the fingers themselves. She flexed them slow and deliberate, forcing blood into the tips. The scraping motion against the frozen ground had slowed to almost nothing. The wind shifted. Somewhere above the gully's edge, a sound came through, low and rhythmic. She almost didn't recognize it at first because her mind had started doing that thing where it simplifies, where it files away information and stops processing the extra. But the sound kept coming, getting louder. Iron on stone, wheels. She tried to stand. Her legs didn't cooperate on the first attempt. She got one knee up, planted her palm in the snow, and pushed, slow, heavy. She made it upright and scrambled up the gully's bank on her hands and knees, breaking the icy crust with her weight. The road was right there. The wagon was right there. A freight rig, big and loaded, pulled by 2 draft horses blowing steam in the cold air. The man driving it sat up on the bench with his hat pulled low and his coat pulled up, and everything about him said he was focused entirely on the road ahead, on the ice, on keeping his rig from sliding off the mountain. She opened her mouth. What came out wasn't a word exactly, more of a sound, raw and hoarse from days without water that wasn't snow melt. But it was enough. The man's head came up. He pulled back on the reins with both hands, smooth and practiced, no panic in it. The horses slowed, stopped. He sat there for a moment, looking at her from across the short distance between them, and she looked back at him. She saw him take stock of the situation. That was the only way to describe it. The way a man does when he's learned to read the wilderness fast, because slow reading gets you killed. His eyes went to her face, her coat, the lump at her chest where Wyatt was tucked, the split flour sack half buried in the snow behind her, the gully she'd crawled out of. She watched him understand all of it. In about 4 seconds, he set the brake. Climbed down. He was a big man, broad through the shoulder, with a dark beard and a scar that ran from his left cheekbone, down past his jaw, a rough, puckered line that spoke of something that had tried very hard to end him and hadn't quite managed it. He moved with the kind of steadiness that had nothing to do with being slow. It was just efficiency. Every step exact. He walked to her, stopped a foot away. He looked at her face again, really looked, the way people rarely did, not past her or around her, but directly at her. And then he looked at the bundle beneath her coat, and something shifted in his jaw, a tightening. Not pity. Something harder than pity. He didn't ask if she was all right. That would have been a stupid question, and he didn't appear to waste words on stupid questions. He reached out, tucked one arm beneath her elbow, and his other hand at the small of her back, and he helped her to the wagon. She was not a small woman. She knew what it took to move her weight, had lived her whole life, watching people make calculations about it. He made no calculation. He didn't strain or adjust or hesitate. He just helped her walk. And when they reached the wagon, he put his hands at her waist and boosted her up onto the bench with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a man loading freight. She almost broke right there. Almost. She pressed her lips together and held on. He went around to the driver's side, released the brake, gathered the reins. Then he paused. He looked at her coat. At Wyatt. She opened the flap, just enough to show him. The baby's face was pale and still, eyes shut, lips faintly blue at the corners, but breathing. Still breathing. The man reached behind the bench without looking, pulled out a heavy pelt wolf by the look of it, and laid it across her lap and over the baby. He tucked it around Wyatt's head with one hand while holding the reins with the other. Then he clicked to the horses and the wagon began to move. Abby stared straight ahead at the road. The trees on either side were dark shapes in the blowing white. The wind cut sideways across the mountain, and she felt it, but less than before. The pelt was heavy and warm, and smelled like pine smoke and leather. She didn't cry. She was too depleted for tears, and besides, there was nothing to cry about yet. She was alive. Wyatt was alive. That was the whole equation right now. She glanced at the man beside her. He was watching the road, just the road, hands easy on the reins, shoulders set against the wind. The scar along his jaw had gone silvery at the edges in the cold air. He was maybe 40, maybe less. It was hard to tell on a man who'd lived outside for years. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked what happened, or where she was going, or what she was doing, alone on a mountain with a baby and a split flour sack in the middle of a blizzard. He'd just picked her up. She wanted to say something. Thank you seemed too small, and everything else felt too large for the space between two strangers on a wagon bench in a snowstorm. So she said nothing. She held Wyatt closer, felt his tiny ribs expanding and contracting against her palm, and she let the wagon carry them higher into the mountain. Whatever came next, she was no longer waiting in a frozen gully for a man who was never going to turn around. That had to be enough. For now, that was everything. The blizzard hit them before they reached the pass. It didn't build slow. It didn't give warning. 1 minute the wind was sharp and lateral. The next it was a wall, white and roaring and absolute, swallowing the road whole. The horses threw their heads. The man beside her she still didn't know. His name leaned forward on the bench and squinted into the white, like he was reading something written in the storm. He knew this mountain. She could tell by the way he didn't panic. He clicked to the horses, kept them moving, and angled the rig toward a dark crease in the rock face to the right. A pass, narrow enough that the wagon's wheels cleared the stone walls by maybe a foot on each side. The iron rims ground against the rock, and the sound echoed back at them from every direction, low and metallic and wrong feeling in the stomach. Abby tucked Wyatt tighter. The baby had stirred once, a small mewling protest at the cold, and she'd pressed her lips to the top of his head and breathed warm air into his hair. He'd settled again. She needed him to stay settled. The pelt across her lap was doing its work. She was cold, but not dangerously cold. Her fingers were starting to feel again, which meant the ache had come back in full, a deep, burning throb in every joint. She didn't complain about it. Pain was just the body reporting in. It meant she was still there. The man drove with both hands firm on the reins, controlling the horses through the narrowing corridor of rock. The wagon pitched on a rough section, and he corrected without hesitation, pulling left and then easing right. He was good at this. Calm the way a person gets from doing hard things long enough, that hard stops, meaning hard. Then the left wheel hit the ice shelf. She felt it before she saw it a lurch, deep and lurching, the whole wagon tilting to the left like a scale, tipping past its limit. The right wheels came up off the stone. The horses screamed. The man threw his weight against the reins and hauled. But there was nothing to haul against because the ground wasn't there on the left side anymore. She looked past him and saw it sheer drop, gray and black and bottomless, just 15 inches beyond the left wheels, which were hanging, spinning, finding nothing. The wagon teetered. It was maybe 2 seconds, maybe less. Timed as that, in the worst moments it stretches, pulls apart at the seams, makes room for everything. She didn't scream. She didn't grab for the bench or brace her feet or squeeze her eyes shut. She moved. She pulled Wyatt hard against her chest. With her left arm, turned and threw herself across the wagon bed to the right side. All of her, every pound that Josiah had complained about, every inch that had made her too much for doorways and chairs and men with small ideas about what a woman should take up. She threw it all to the right side of that wagon, and she held on. The shift was immediate. Physics doesn't negotiate. Weight is weight, and she had enough of it. The right wheels slammed back down onto stone. The left wheels dropped and caught. The wagon shuddered like a living thing, and the horses lurched forward, scrambling for purchase, and the man on the bench yanked the reins and kept them straight. For a moment, nothing moved except the storm. Then the horses blew out. Long, shaking exhales, steam rising off their flanks in the white air. The man sat absolutely still on the bench. Abby was on her knees in the wagon bed, Wyatt pressed against her chest. Her right shoulder had hit the side rail and would bruise something fierce by morning. Her heart was moving fast. She could feel it in her throat, in her wrists. But she was steady. She looked up. The man had turned on the bench. He was looking at her. Not the way people usually looked at her. Not measuring, not calculating, not finding the word for what they saw, and filing it somewhere unflattering. He was looking at her the way you look at something that just surprised you so completely that your face hasn't caught up yet. She met his eyes. Dark brown. Still, a long scratch ran through his left eyebrow from the bare scar, and it gave his expression a permanent gravity. Like everything he looked at seriously. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the horses. "Hold on," he said, the first words he'd spoken since he helped her into the wagon. His voice was low, deliberate, like everything else about him. She got herself upright again, settled back against the pelt-lined sidewall of the wagon bed, and held Wyatt, and held on. He navigated the rest of the pass-by, feel as much as by sight, because the snow was so thick now that the rock walls were just dark suggestions on either side. He kept the horses to a crawl. He didn't rush them, didn't push. He read the road through the reins the way some men read books, careful, patient, pulling meaning out of what wasn't visible. It took a long time. She didn't know how long. She stopped tracking it. At some point, the rock walls fell away, and the road opened up, and she felt the angle change beneath them level ground, then a slight downward slope. The storm was still howling, but the walls of rock had blocked the worst of it in the pass, and now the trees were doing the same, big, dark pines closing in on either side of the trail, cutting the wind. She smelt smoke before she saw the cabin. Just a trace of it through the snow smell, but unmistakable. Pine smoke. Something burning for warmth. The horses slowed on their own. They knew this place. The cabin materialized out of the white. Heavy log construction, low slung, built against the mountain's face on the north side, so the rock itself served as the rear wall. A covered porch. One dark window. The door was set deep under the eave, and a pair of large, pale wolfhounds appeared from somewhere, circling the horses with businesslike efficiency. The man set the brake. He climbed down and came around to her side without being asked. He reached up, and she took his arm, and he helped her down from the wagon bed, the same way he'd helped her up, no ceremony, no strain she could see, just steadiness. Her boots hit the ground. Her knees held. He looked at Wyatt, still bundled against her chest. The baby color was better. A little pink at the cheeks now. The man nodded at the door. "Get inside," she went. The wolfhounds pressed against her legs as she moved, not aggressive, just curious, enormous heads at her hip level. She pushed through the heavy door, and the warmth hit her like a physical thing. It had smell to it, that warmth, pine sap and old wool and something cooking, an iron pot on a low fire with the lid chattering softly. The fire was built up and real, not just embers. He'd banked it before he left, built it high enough to last through a long run. The cabin was one room, everything functional and nothing decorative. A sleeping loft above with a rope ladder, a work table, a stone hearth that took up most of the south wall. Pelts everywhere on the floor, hanging from hooks, stacked against the far wall in neat bundles. A rifle above the door on iron brackets. 2 chairs, both heavy oak, pulled close to the fire. She stood there and let the warmth work on her. He came in behind her, stamped the snow from his boots, and moved to the fire without breaking stride. He added 2 logs from a stack beside the hearth. Sparks jumped. The fire grabbed the new wood, and the room got brighter. He didn't ask her to sit. He didn't offer. He just kept moving to the pot on the fire, lifted the lid, checked whatever was inside, replaced it to a shelf on the side wall where he pulled a tin cup and filled it with water from a covered crock. He brought it to her. She drank the whole thing without stopping. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was until the water was moving, and then it was gone, and her whole body seemed to exhale. He took the cup back, refilled it, handed it to her again. Then he crossed to the far side of the room and began building a small box-like frame from a clean crate near the work table. Lined it with a folded pelt and set it close to the hearth. He looked at the bundle against her chest. She understood. She opened her coat, unwrapped Wyatt carefully, and laid him in the makeshift bed by the fire. He stirred, blinked once at the orange light, and closed his eyes again. His breathing was even and deep. She stood there looking at him for a moment. The relief was enormous, too large to speak. She didn't try to speak it. She straightened up. The man was at the work table now, cutting something dried meat, hardtack, pulling a tin plate together with the efficiency of someone who has fed himself alone in the wilderness for a long time and wasted nothing doing it. He set it at the table's edge without calling her over. She sat down, she ate. Outside, the blizzard raged. The heavy log walls didn't shake. They didn't flex. They absorbed the storm the way all solid things absorb pressure by simply refusing to move. The wind screamed at the eave, and the fire crackled back, and the iron pot lid chattered, and Wyatt breathed in his pelt-lined crate by the hearth. The man sat in the other chair with his own plate and ate without looking at her. She thought about the wagon, about the drop on the left side, about throwing herself across the wagon bed. She thought about Josiah's voice. "You're slowing us down. You're too heavy. You eat too much." She thought about how that same weight had just dragged a tipping wagon back from a cliff edge in a mountain blizzard and saved 3 lives, including her own. She looked at her hands, still a little raw from the frozen ground, still gritty at the creases from the ruined flower. She rubbed her thumb across her palm. Across the room, the man glanced up from his plate. Their eyes met briefly. He looked back down. She looked back down, too. But something had passed between them in that look. Something that didn't need naming yet. He'd watched her save the wagon. He'd seen what she'd done, and he'd understood exactly what it meant. 'Cause he was a man who dealt in real things, and real things don't need commentary. She was not a liability. She was a counterbalance. Whatever Josiah had decided she was, this mountain had just rendered a different verdict. She finished eating. She picked up Wyatt, sat in the chair close to the fire, and held him while he slept. The storm outside went on for hours. At some point, the man climbed the rope ladder to the loft. At some point, she slept too, right there in the chair, with the baby against her chest and the fire warm on her face. For the first time in 4 days, she slept without waiting to die. She woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. Not burnt or weak or stretched thin with whatever was handy. Real, dark, proper coffee. The smell of it filling the cabin so completely that for a moment she forgot where she was. She blinked at the fire, at the hearthstones, at the pelt-lined crate beside her, where Wyatt was making small waking sounds, fist-pumping the air, working up to something louder. She scooped him up before he could start in earnest, and pressed her lips against his forehead. Warm. Properly warm. The blue had gone from his lips entirely, replaced with the ordinary pink of a baby who'd been well-fed and well-slept, which he hadn't been yet, but at least the cold had let him go. The man was at the fire. He had a pot on the hook over the coals, and a second pot on the flat stone beside the grate, and he was moving between them with the unhurried economy of someone who cooked the same way. He drove no wasted motion, no fuss. He didn't look up when she stirred, but a moment later he lifted a tin cup from the shelf without turning around and set it on the table, which meant he'd heard her wake up. She settled Wyatt against her shoulder, stood and crossed to the table. The coffee was black and thick enough to stand a spoon in. She drank it and felt the heat move down through her chest and into her arms. Her fingers wrapped the cup, and she just stood there for a moment, breathing it. Outside, the storm was still going. She could hear it in the eave. In the place where the chimney pushed through the roof, a low, cycling moan wind, finding every gap it could and complaining about the ones it couldn't. But the walls didn't answer. The cabin sat in the roar of it and was simply still. Last night she'd been too exhausted and too cold to properly take stock of where she was. Now she looked. The cabin was maybe 30 feet by 20, every inch used. The pelts she'd noticed last night were organized by type along the west wall: beaver, mink, wolf, fox, all bundled and stacked with the precision of someone who made his living selling them and knew exactly what he had. The work table was scarred deep with knife marks and smoothed in others from years of hands. Above it, 3 shelves, tools on the first, tins and dried goods on the second, and a row of small glass jars on the third. Herbs, she thought, dried and labeled in a cramped, careful hand she couldn't read from across the room. 2 chairs by the fire. The sleeping loft above. A door on the north wall that likely led to a storeroom, or the horse shelter. She could hear the draft horses moving through it. A low shifting sound, hooves on packed earth. It was spare, but it wasn't poor. There was a difference. The man had built this place for function and function only, and in doing that, he'd made something solid and real that no storm had yet managed to shake. That said something. She wasn't sure what it said about him exactly, but she filed it away. He brought a bowl from the pot and set it in front of her without ceremony. Porridge, dense and hot, with what looked like dried berries worked through it. She looked at the bowl. It was full, properly full, not the polite half-serving she'd trained herself to expect and accept. Abby sat down. She picked up the spoon and took one small bite. Set the spoon down. In her experience, eating in front of people required management. She took small portions, ate slowly, tried to be invisible about it, tried to take up as little of the meal and the room and the air as possible. It was automatic. She'd been doing it so long she almost didn't notice herself doing it, but he noticed. He was sitting in the other chair with his own bowl, and he was watching her not rudely, not pointedly, just the way he seemed to watch everything, which was directly and without apology. He looked at her small spoon and her full bowl, and the careful way she was managing herself. He looked at Wyatt in her lap. He looked at her face. Then he stood. He went to the pot on the hook and ladled out a second bowl, adding it to what was already in front of her, so the thing was now nearly overflowing. He put it down. He sat back in his chair. He said, "Fat kept you breathing through the blizzard, Abby. Out here, nobody judges a deep-rooted pine for taking up space." Eat. The use of her name stopped her. She hadn't told him her name. She'd been too cold for introductions on that wagon bench. And once they reached the cabin, it hadn't come up. She looked at him, and then she understood. Her travel bag was still in his wagon, the one Josiah had left behind when he'd stopped to let her stretch her legs. It had her name on the tag. He'd brought it in at some point while she slept. He was watching her work it out. He waited. She picked up the spoon. She ate properly. A real mouthful, then another. The porridge was good, not fancy, but solid and warm, and exactly what a body needed after days of nothing. Wyatt pressed against her arm, and she ate around him, steady and unhurried, and she didn't put the spoon down until the bowl was empty. He said nothing more about it. He just ate his own bowl and looked at the fire. "Gideon?" he said, after a minute, not looking at her, just offering it the way he offered everything plain and without decoration. "Abby," she said back, even though he already knew. "I know," she almost smiled. Almost. She looked down at Wyatt, who had grabbed her thumb and was examining it with the serious concentration of a baby who has recently discovered hands. "His name is Wyatt," she said. "He's 7 months. He was my sister's." She paused. She didn't make it through the birth. Gideon looked at the baby, at the way the firelight moved across Wyatt's face. He gave a single nod. No condolences, no performance of sympathy. Just acknowledgement, clean and real, that he'd heard her and understood. It was, she found, exactly the right response. She was tired of condolences. Condolences were for people who hadn't yet picked up and kept moving. The storm went on outside. She cleaned up the bowls without being asked, found the wash basin and the water crock by feel and logic, and washed them while Wyatt sat propped in her pelt-lined crate by the fire, batting at the air. Gideon went to the back door and through it. She could hear him with the horses' low, brief sounds, the kind a man makes not to communicate, but just to let an animal know the human presence is familiar and safe. A while later, he came back, shed his outer coat, and hung it on the peg by the door. Then he went to the corner of the cabin where a 3-legged stool sat near the hearth, and he picked it up, examined it, and set it aside. He pulled the heavy oak rocking chair from its place near the wall. He turned it over, looked at the joints, set it down right side up. He went to the work table and opened a lower drawer and took out a coil of iron wire and what looked like a set of iron brackets, small and solid. He worked quietly. It took maybe 20 minutes. When he was done, he set the rocking chair back in its spot near the fire, tested it by pressing down hard with both hands on the arms, and then sitting his own weight into it, rocking once, forward and back. He stood up. She understood the invitation. She went to the chair and sat, gathered Wyatt from his crate, and settled him in her lap. She rocked once, forward and back. The chair didn't shift, didn't creak in that uncertain way that made your stomach drop right before something gave way. It held perfectly, rock steady, the brackets at the joints, taking the distribution of weight without complaint. She looked at Gideon. He was already at the work table with his back to her. She looked down at Wyatt. He had both fists up, eyes heavy, the warmth and the motion doing their work. She rocked him slowly, and the chair moved without protest beneath her, strong and steady, and something behind her breastbone, unclenched, that had been wound tight for a long, long time. She didn't cry, but it was close. He'd reinforced the chair before she asked. Before she'd even sat in it once, he'd looked at her. And he'd looked at the chair, and he'd understood without being told. And he'd fixed it, because that was what you did when something needed fixing. No comment, no drawn-out moment of recognition. Just iron brackets and 20 minutes of quiet work. She thought of every chair she'd ever approached sideways. Every bench she'd tested with one hand before committing her weight. Every hostess who'd smiled at her and then looked at the furniture. This man had not looked at the furniture that way. He'd looked at the furniture and thought, that needs to be stronger. Wyatt fell asleep. The storm went on all that day and into the next night. Gideon moved through the cabin in a steady, quiet rhythm, tending the fire, checking the horses, working on pelts at the table with a scraper and stretching boards. He didn't talk much. She didn't either. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just what it was, two people in a small space, learning the shape of each other through proximity and small acts rather than through explanation. She found where he kept the diapers clean cloth squares, which told her he'd either had visitors before or he planned for contingencies. And she changed Wyatt and washed the dirty ones in the basin and hung them near the fire to dry. She found the bread tin and the grain sacks, and she made bread because she knew how, and because standing at a work table doing something useful was better than sitting still and feeling helpless. He watched her work the dough for a moment when he came in from the horses. He said nothing. But he moved a low stool close to the table without being asked, so she had somewhere to rest one foot while she worked. Her back had been aching. She hadn't said so. She looked at the stool. She looked at him. He was already across the room. Late in the second afternoon, the wind began to shift. Not stop, just change pitch. The high scream, dropping to something lower and more sustainable. Gideon paused in his work and looked at the ceiling for a moment, listening. Easing, he said. Good, she said. She was nursing Wyatt. The baby had been fussy through the afternoon, overtired, and nothing settled him but the nearness of her, the heartbeat and the warmth. And she watched Gideon across the room as he went back to the pelt at his table, scraper moving in long, deliberate strokes. He was not a comfortable-looking man, exactly. The scar on his jaw and the roughness of his hands and the way he held himself, careful, watchful, never entirely. Off-guard said he had not had a comfortable life and didn't expect one. But he was decent. She could see that clearly. Decency wasn't a quality that hid well, and it didn't perform well either. It just showed up in small things, over and over, until the pattern was undeniable. The reinforced chair, the full bowl, the stool at the work table. A name offered plain. Wyatt finished, and she settled him against her shoulder and patted his back, watching the fire. Thank you, she said. Not for any one thing, for all of it. Gideon scraped the pelt. Storm's not over yet, he said, which was true. It wasn't, but she was inside the walls, and the fire was real, and the chair held her weight, and her son was breathing warm and even against her neck, and outside the blizzard raged itself slowly toward its end. And for the first time in longer than she could properly remember, Abby Preston felt like a person who was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not saved, not rescued, not taken in out of pity, settled on her own weight, in a solid place, with someone nearby who'd looked at her and seen something worth reinforcing rather than something worth leaving behind on a frozen road. That was enough. More than enough. She rocked the baby. The fire burned. The storm eased, inch by inch, into the long, quiet night. The storm broke on the third morning. Not gradually, it just stopped, the way mountain weather does, as if someone on the other side of the range pulled a curtain and the whole performance was over. The wind dropped to nothing. The clouds thinned and let the sun through, and the sun hit the snow, and the snow threw it back, and the whole world, outside the cabin window, went white and blinding. And still, Abby stood at the window with Wyatt on her hip and squinted into it. The trees were buried to their lowest branches. The porch railing had disappeared entirely under a smooth, unbroken drift. The wagon was a white shape in the yard, recognizable only by its proportion. Behind her, Gideon was already pulling on his outer coat. Horses first, he said, not to her particularly, just saying what came next. She nodded. He went out, and she listened to the crunch of his boots breaking through the crust in the yard, steady and diminishing as he moved toward the horse shelter. Wyatt watched the window. He'd been watching things more lately, the firelight, the movement of the wolfhounds, Gideon's hands when he worked. 7 months old, and already taking inventory of the world. Smart, she told him. Keep doing that. He grabbed her collar and tried to put it in his mouth. She wiped down the table, fed the fire, put the coffee on. By the time Gideon came back in stomping snow from his boots on the porch boards, she had a plate waiting. He sat, he ate. She sat across from him with Wyatt in her lap and ate her own breakfast. And this was already, in 3 days, a pattern. It had the feeling of something that had been going on longer than it had. After, he went to the work table and took up a piece of medium sandpaper from the drawer and folded it twice. He crouched at the corner of the table closest to the fire and began working the wood. Long, even strokes. She watched from the rocking chair, one hand on Wyatt's back as he slept. She watched him work the corner, then the next one. He moved around the table on his knees, methodical, checking each edge with his thumb before moving on. She understood what he was doing before she understood why she understood it. She walked past this table a dozen times a day. The table sat between the hearth and the door to the back room, and the path from the rocking chair to the kitchen shelf to the water crock took her around it, on both sides. Twice now, she'd caught her hip on the far corner, once hard enough to leave a mark she'd checked in private, and found purple. She hadn't said anything. She hadn't limped. She hadn't done anything to indicate. The table was a problem. He'd noticed anyway. He worked all 4 corners, then ran the sandpaper along both long edges at hip height. He did it without commentary, without pausing to see if she was watching. He just worked the wood until it was smooth and rounded and incapable of leaving a bruise, and then he put the sandpaper back in the drawer and washed the sawdust from his hands in the basin. Abby looked at the table corners. She thought about the chair, the stool, the full bowl. She thought about how it had never once occurred to Josiah that the problem might not be her size, but the world's unwillingness to accommodate it. She'd spent 4 years with that man believing the fault was hers, that if she were just less, just smaller, just quieter about her own needs, then everything would work. Gideon Cross had known her 3 days and was sanding the corners off his furniture. She didn't say anything. He wouldn't have wanted her to. That much she'd already learned about him. He did things because they needed doing, not because he wanted credit for doing them. She just filed it away, the way she was filing all of it. The days developed their own shape after that. Gideon went out in the mornings to check his trap lines, long loops through the mountain timber that took 2 to 3 hours depending on the snow depth. He came back with whatever he'd caught, worked the pelts at the table through the afternoon, and went out again near dusk to check the lower lines and feed the horses. Abby managed the cabin while he was gone, the fire, the cooking, Wyatt, the washing. Not because it was assigned to her, but because it was what needed doing. And she was there. When he came back and she was cooking, he didn't walk in and take over. When she was feeding Wyatt and the fire needed wood, he added logs without being asked. They navigated the small space with an instinctive courtesy that surprised her, not bumping into each other, making room, passing things without being asked. She'd lived with Josiah for 6 weeks before the wagon. 6 weeks of a man who moved through space as if she weren't in it, who reached over and around her and past her without acknowledgement, who had looked through her so consistently that she'd started to feel transparent. Gideon looked at her when she spoke. He listened. He didn't fill the silence with himself, he just occupied it, alongside her, which was different. One afternoon, she found him at the work table, with a wolf pelt, spread flat, combing out the guard hairs with a wide-toothed tool. She was making stew at the fire with Wyatt in the crate beside her, and she watched his hands move through the fur without really meaning to watch. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. He didn't stop working.
Going on 12 years. Alone?
A pause. Not hesitation. Exactly, more like he was deciding how much of the answer to give. Mostly. She stirred the stew. "You have family?" The pause this time was longer. The comb moved through the fur slow and then stopped. "Half-brother," he said. "Down in the valley." Something in how he said it made her not ask more. The word half carried a lot of weight in that sentence, and none of it was warm. She stirred the stew and let it go. He picked the comb back up and kept working. She learned him in pieces like that. Small facts offered in short supply, never volunteered, but not withheld if she asked directly. He'd come up to the Rockies at 28 after a dispute over his father's land that he didn't specify, and she didn't press. He'd been caught by a grizzly 2 winters in, which explained the scar, which had been worse than it looked because the claws had caught his cheek and shoulder both, and he treated himself with what he had and survived by his own accounting, mostly through stubbornness. He could read, which surprised her. She wasn't sure why it surprised her, only that it did, and he had a small stack of books on a shelf in the loft that she saw when she went up to hang wet cloth to dry. He read at night. She knew it by the faint light from the loft and the silence that meant he wasn't moving around. She read, too, when she could, which lately was only after Wyatt settled. She'd found a collection of essays on the second shelf left by someone she guessed or traded for, and she worked her way through it, slowly, while the fire burned low. It was on the 4th or 5th night that she woke to a different kind of quiet, not the ordinary quiet of the cabin at rest. Something tighter. She lay still in the chair. She'd been sleeping in the rocking chair with a blanket, and Wyatt in his crate beside her, and it was a fine enough arrangement, and she listened. She heard breathing from the loft, but it was wrong. Fast and shallow, with a rough edge underneath. She got up. The rope ladder was easy enough. She went up slow, holding the rail, emerged into the loft space, which was low-ceilinged and warm from the chimney pipe that ran through the back corner. He was on the narrow bed, with one blanket pushed half off, and his eyes closed. She touched the back of her hand to his forehead. He was burning. Not a mild fever, a real one, the kind that sits deep and radiates. She pulled her hand back and looked at his face in the low light from the banked fire below. The scarring along his left cheek was red and inflamed, the skin around it tight and shiny. His shoulder, beneath his undershirt, was moving wrong stiff, not in the rhythm of sleep. The old bear scars. She'd heard of this. Tissue that had healed rough, nerve endings that never quite settled, and when the cold got deep enough and stayed long enough, they answered back. She went down to the shelves, the small glass jars on the 3rd shelf. She took the candle stub from the table and lit it from the fire, and went back to the shelf and read the labels in Gideon's cramped writing willow bark. Pine resin, dried yarrow, something she didn't recognize, dried comfrey, calendula. She knew comfrey. Her mother had grown it. Good for inflammation, for tissue that needed calming. She took that jar. She found the tin of pine resin beside it, which would draw and warm. She made a poultice at the work table, the way she'd been shown. Comfrey ground fine in the wooden bowl, a small amount of resin warmed near the fire until it loosened, mixed together with a little water into a paste that smelled sharp and medicinal and honest. She went back up the ladder. He was awake. Barely his eyes were open but not focused, moving through the fever state where the edges of things go uncertain. He looked at her without recognition for a moment. "It's Abby," she said. "You've got a fever. Your scars are inflamed. I'm going to put something on it." He looked at her, Gideon. Her voice was firm and level, the voice she used with Wyatt when he needed to stop panicking and listen. "I've made a poultice. It'll help. I need you to hold still." He blinked. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was rough. "You're not," she said. "Hold still." He didn't have the energy to argue. She pulled the blanket back from his shoulder and pushed his shirt aside. He didn't flinch, which told her he was more gone into the fever than he seemed. And she looked at the scarring along his left shoulder and jaw, the skin red and tight, the texture rough, where the grizzly's claws had left their permanent record. She'd braced herself for something hard to look at, and the scars were significant, puckered and thick and extensive, nothing that time was ever going to smooth away. But she looked at them and felt exactly what she felt, concern. Practical, clear concern. She wasn't horrified, and she wasn't pitying him, and she wasn't performing bravery. She just looked at what was there. She applied the poultice with both hands, working it into the scarred tissue along his shoulder first, then along his jaw, her fingers careful but not tentative. She worked the way you work when you're trying to do something right, paying attention to where the pressure landed, reading his breath for signs of pain. He was watching her face. She could feel it. He'd come back to himself a little. The eyes had focused, and he was watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite name, suspended, almost, like a man expecting something, and then the thing not happening, and not knowing what to do with the absence of it. "You're not looking away," he said. "Why would I?" He didn't answer, but he held still. She finished the poultice and covered it loosely with a strip of clean cloth. She made him drink a cup of willow bark tea. Before she went back down the ladder, she'd left it cooling on the shelf, and she brought it up, and he drank it without protest, which told her again how bad the fever was. "Sleep," she said. He lay back. He was already most of the way there. She climbed down. Wyatt was still sleeping in his crate, undisturbed. She added a log to the fire and sat in the rocking chair and watched the flames and listened to the breathing from the loft even out. Slower, deeper, the fever breaking its high edge. She sat with it a while, that particular quiet, until her own eyes got heavy. She slept. The wolfhounds were what woke her. Both of them at once, up from their place by the door, ears pitched forward, a low sound starting in the chest of the larger one that built slowly but didn't stop, steady and escalating, directed at the door. Abby was on her feet before she was properly awake. She checked Wyatt, sleeping. She looked at the door. It was barred, the heavy timber drop bars seated in its iron cradles, and the bar wasn't moving, and nothing was coming through it. But the dogs were still talking to it, standing with their weight forward, and then she heard it, faint, under the wind, pounding, a fist on wood, desperate enough to be louder than the cold should allow. And something else, a sound she couldn't identify until she moved to the window and looked out into the blue-gray light of early morning. A dark shape at the door, upright but barely, and behind it, across the snow of the yard, a long dark line, a streak of blood. She didn't open the door immediately. She stood at the window, and she looked at that dark shape, and she thought clearly and fast the way cold air and shock will sometimes make you think. Someone was on the other side of the door. Someone who'd come up the mountain at night in deep snow and was bleeding enough to leave a line of it across the yard. The dogs had not calmed down. They were at a steady, low alert, not wild barking, not panic, but a sustained declaration that something was wrong on the other side of that door. She went to the loft ladder. "Gideon." Nothing Gideon louder, a movement from above. Then his voice, rough with fever and sleep. "What?" Someone at the door. "There's blood in the snow." A pause. Then the creak of the bed and the sound of boots hitting the floor. He came down the ladder, slower than usual, one hand tight on the rail. His face was flushed, but his eyes were clear enough. He took the rifle from the brackets above the door, without her having to suggest it. He moved her gently to the side with one hand and looked out the window himself. She watched him look, watched his face. Something changed in it, a small thing. An almost imperceptible shift around the eyes, not fear, not recognition exactly, but something harder, something that had a history behind it. "Stay with the baby," he said. He lifted the bar. The man outside fell through the door, not dramatically, just crumpled forward at the threshold, catching himself on his hands and knees, and the cold air came through the open door like a wave, and both wolfhounds stepped back and then forward again, confused. Gideon caught the door and kept it open with his boot, and looked down at the man on the floor. Abby looked too. He was not a large man, medium height, soft through the middle, dressed in what had been good clothes, a wool coat, leather gloves, a hat that was now missing, and all of it was ruined, soaked through with snow melt, stiff at the sleeves, and collar with partial freeze. His right hand was wrapped in cloth that had been white. It was not white now. His face was turned sideways on the floor, and she could see him breathing, the breath ragged and wet-sounding. He was alive. Not by much. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Abby. Something in his expression said, "I know who this is, and it's complicated." And then it closed off again. And he said, "Get the fire up." She got the fire up. She added 2 logs and worked the coals until the room was pushing heat. And by then Gideon had the man off the floor and into the chair nearest the hearth, sitting upright with his head lolling. The dogs retreated to the far wall and lay down, still watching. Abby brought water. She looked at the man's face, her stomach turned over. She stood very still and looked at him for a long second, at the soft jaw and the thin mouth, and the particular arrangement of features that she had believed, had counted on, had staked her, and Wyatt's survival on, would be the face of a fresh start in a new place. Josiah Blackwood. Sitting in Gideon Cross's cabin on the side of a rocky mountain, with frostbitten hands and gangrene, already working up his right forearm, and a face the color of old chalk. She said nothing. She took the water back to the shelf and stood there with her back to the room and breathed. Once, twice, she heard Gideon behind her. "Quiet. You know him." It wasn't a question. She turned around. "He's my husband," she said. "The man who left me in the road." Gideon looked at her. Then he looked at Josiah. Josiah's eyes had opened. He was still mostly gone fever, exposure, the particular confusion of a man whose body had been running on fear for a long time, and had finally stopped, but he was looking at the ceiling. And then he moved his eyes around the room slowly, taking stock, and then his eyes landed on her. His face went through several things in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something that, in another man, might have been shame, but in Josiah she recognized as the beginnings of a calculation. He blinked, his lips moved. "Abby," he said, weak and rough, and with an attempt at warmth in it that made her jaw tighten. Thank God you're alive. I looked for you, I've been looking. The storm came so fast." "Don't," she said. He stopped. She crossed her arms and looked at him, and said again, "Don't." He looked at Gideon, at the rifle. He looked at the cabin. He was running the numbers. She could see it, trying to figure out what he was dealing with, and what story would work best. Gideon stood by the door with his arms at his sides. He didn't speak. He looked at Josiah with a flat, steady attention that Josiah clearly found unsettling, because he shifted in the chair and then winced hard from the movement. The infection in his arm was bad. Abby could smell it from where she stood, that particular Swedish wrong smell that meant tissue dying in place. His right hand inside the ruined cloth wrap was bad, too. The fingers visible at the ends were dark and waxy. Frostbite well past the first stage. He was not going to die this minute, but without treatment he'd be dead within days. And without a doctor, which was not a thing available on this mountain, treatment meant whatever she and Gideon could manage themselves. She looked at Gideon. He went to the work table and opened the lower drawer and took out the medical kit, a flat tin box, battered from years of use, with a latch on the front. He crossed the room and set it on the small table beside Josiah's chair. He looked at Abby. He didn't say anything. He just set the kit down and looked at her and took a step back. She understood the offer. She understood the space he was giving her, the choice he was leaving entirely in her hands. She could treat the man who'd left her to freeze to death in a gully, or she could not. Josiah was watching her now. The calculation had shifted into something more naked and less controlled. He was afraid, really afraid. Not performing it, not managing it. Just afraid, the way a man gets when he runs out of options and has to rely on the mercy of someone he treated without any. I'm going to need warm water, she said. Clean cloth. Whatever you've got for infection. Gideon went to get it. She pulled the small table closer and sat in the second chair facing Josiah, and she opened the tin and looked at what was inside. Needle and thread. Bandaging. A bottle of carbolic solution. Small sealed tin of drawing salve. Lancet. Abby. Josiah's voice had shifted again, softer now, and more careful. Now that he saw she was going to help him. I know what you're thinking. But I swear to you, it wasn't how it seemed. The horses, they were spooked, and I lost control of the rig, and by the time I got them stopped, you were gone. The storm had come up so fast, she looked at him. He stopped talking. I'm going to tell you something, she said, and you're going to listen. He waited. I'm not saving you because you deserve it, she said. Her voice was even, not angry. She'd moved past angry. Somewhere in the 3 days she'd spent warming back to life in this cabin. I'm saving you because I refuse to let my hands become as filthy as yours. My humanity isn't yours to take. Josiah stared at her. She opened the carbolic solution and began unwrapping the cloth from his hand. He flinched when the air hit the skin. She worked carefully and without hurrying, cleaning what could be cleaned, assessing what was beyond it. The two smallest fingers on his right hand were gone to frostbite in a way that a surgeon in a city would have removed immediately and cleanly. But out here, it was a slower process, and a worse one. The forearm infection would need to be lanced and drained. It would hurt him badly. Good, said a small part of her. And then she set that part aside because it wasn't useful. Gideon brought the warm water. He set it on the table, and he didn't look at Josiah. And Josiah didn't look at him. There was something between them that Abby felt but couldn't read yet, a mutual awareness that went past simple stranger recognition. She worked for an hour. She drained the infection with the lancet. Josiah screamed once, and then bit down on the leather strap she gave him, and she flushed the wound with carbolic and packed it with the drawing salve and wrapped it in clean cloth. She did what she could for the frostbitten fingers, which was limited and grim. She made him drink willow bark tea, which he did without complaint. Pain had stripped away his performance entirely. By the time she was done, he was half asleep and shivering, and she covered him with a blanket and stepped back. Gideon was at the work table. He'd been there the whole time, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough to give her room to work. He was watching Josiah now with that same flat steadiness, and she crossed the room and stood beside him, and they both looked at the man in the chair. You knew him? She said quietly. Not a question either, this time. Gideon's jaw shifted. I know of him, he said. His name is Josiah Blackwood. He was my brother's man. Accountant. She looked at him. Harlan Cross, Gideon said. The name came out flat and contained. Valley mining operation. He runs a good portion of what comes in and out of the lower pass. Ruthless man. He paused. My father's other son. She absorbed that. Looked at Josiah sleeping in the chair. Thought about Josiah with a mail order. Bride setup as a cover for a border run. And about the gold. And about why he'd made for this particular cabin on this particular mountain. He wasn't wandering, she said. No, Gideon agreed. He came here. On purpose. There's a stolen bag of mining gold somewhere in his packs, Gideon said. I'd wager everything in this cabin on that. She would have wagered the same. She crossed to Josiah's coat, where it was hanging by the door. She'd stripped it off him when they got him in and went through the inner pockets with both hands. The third pocket was heavy. She pulled out a drawstring bag, leather, soft and dark with use. It was dense in her palm. She set it on the work table and opened the drawstring, and the gold inside caught the firelight. She and Gideon looked at it. Harlan's men will come for it, Gideon said. He said it without agitation, just laying down the fact. He doesn't let things go. Wyatt made a sound from his crate by the fire, a small waking noise, just coming up out of sleep. Abby went to him, lifted him, held him against her chest, and stood in the middle of the cabin with the gold on the table, and Josiah breathing badly in the chair and Gideon by the window now, looking out at the yard, his face unreadable. She looked at Gideon's back. At the breadth of his shoulders and the scar, she could see along the edge of his jaw, even from here. He'd come to the mountain to live his life clean and separate from whatever his half-brother represented. And his half-brother's stolen gold had just walked through his door on the feet of a man who'd come here intending, she had no doubt, something much worse than asking for shelter. She looked down at Wyatt. He looked back at her, wide awake now, perfectly serious. I know, she said to him quietly. Whatever was coming down from that valley, it was coming. The question was just how ready they'd be when it arrived. Josiah Blackwood woke up on the second morning and found Abby Preston standing over him. She was holding a tin cup of broth and looking at him with an expression that was neither warm nor cruel, just steady and clear. The way you look at a problem you've already solved and are now simply managing. The fire was behind her. The wolfhounds were at the far wall, and the large, heavy-framed woman he'd left to die in a frozen gully was, by every visible measure, doing considerably better than he was. He tried to sit up. His arm reminded him immediately what a poor idea that was. The infection had gone deep before Abby got to it. The lancing the night before had taken the worst pressure off, but the forearm was still swollen and hot to the touch, wrapped in clean cloth that had already yellowed at the center. His two smallest fingers on the right hand were a mottled, waxy dark that he'd stopped looking at directly, because looking at them made his vision go strange at the edges. He'd been a man of ledgers and numbers his whole life. He understood loss accounting. He understood when something was already in the deficit column, and no amount of entry shifting was going to change that. His fingers were already in the deficit column. His whole situation, frankly, was in the deficit column. He looked past Abby to where Gideon Cross sat at the work table, working a piece of leather with a stitching awl. Gideon hadn't looked up. Hadn't looked at Josiah directly since the first night, which was its own kind of pressure, the deliberate, sustained withholding of acknowledgement from a man who looked like he could pick up the chair Josiah was sitting in, with Josiah still in it, and set it outside in the snow without significant effort. Josiah had heard of Gideon Cross. Harlan talked about his half-brother, the way people talk about a wall that won't move, not with respect exactly, more with the frustrated acknowledgement that some things simply don't respond to force, or money, or persuasion. Gideon had walked away from the family property dispute 12 years ago, and hadn't come back, and hadn't communicated, and hadn't been reachable by any method Harlan had tried, which apparently Harlan had tried several times, for reasons he didn't elaborate on with his accountant. Josiah had understood, planning his border run, that the trapper's cabin on the North Ridge would be empty in deep winter, that Gideon would be running his lines, that a man could shelter there, rest his horses, then move on before the trapper came back. He had not anticipated that Gideon would come back early. He had not anticipated the blizzard closing the upper pass. He had not anticipated the frostbite, or the infection, or the fact that his own body would simply quit on him 300 yards from the cabin door. And he had absolutely not anticipated Abby. She held the broth out. He took it with his left hand. It was hot and tasted like venison and sage, and he was so depleted that it was the best thing he'd ever put in his mouth, which was a wretched irony, he noted, internally, and said nothing about. She sat down in the opposite chair and looked at him while he drank. He thought about what she'd said the night before, while she was draining his arm, and he was barely on the right side of consciousness. He'd run it back a few times since. I'm not saving you because you deserve it. I'm saving you because I refuse to let my hands become as filthy as yours. My humanity isn't yours to take. He'd expected her to be different. In his experience, women who had been wronged badly wanted either revenge or an apology, and both of those he could work with, because both of those put him in a position to manage the conversation. He was good at managing conversations. But she hadn't wanted either. She'd cleaned his infected arm and wrapped his dead fingers and made him drink tea while looking at him like he was a ledger entry. Not a person she hated, and not a person she forgave. Just a fact she was dealing with, cleanly and without sentiment. He didn't know what to do with that. He defaulted to what he knew. Abby, he said. He kept his voice low and rough at the edges, wounded man soft. I need you to hear me. What happened on that road, Josiah? He stopped. I've already told you once, she said. I won't tell you again. He looked at her hands, resting loose in her lap, at the set of her shoulders and the line of her jaw, and the absolute absence of anything in her face that wanted what he was selling. He'd left this woman in the road. He'd calculated the weight of her against the weight of the horse's endurance, against the weight of the rations, against the weight of his own urgency to get to the border. Before Harlan's men figured out what he'd done, and she'd come up short in that calculation, and he'd left her she'd survived. That wasn't in his calculation either. The gold, he said. He shifted approaches the way he always did when one avenue closed. You found it. Obviously. That's Harlan's gold, Abby. Harlan crosses. You know what he'll do when he comes for it, and he will come for it if it's not there. He'll burn this place to the ground. It's already there, Gideon said from the work table, still not looking up. We know what Harlan does. Josiah looked at him. You haven't seen him in 12 years. I know what he is, Gideon said. Flat, final, that doesn't change. Josiah was quiet for a moment. He drank the broth. He looked at the fire and ran his numbers and found that every column came up short, which was a novel experience for a man who had spent his adult life ensuring that other people's columns came up short while his didn't. He tried once more. Abby. He made his voice smaller. Truly small, not performed. He was exhausted enough that the performance was mostly gone anyway, and what was left was something approaching the truth. I know I don't deserve your help. I know what I did. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you not to let me die here. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and went to the work table and came back with a clean roll of bandaging and the tin of drawing salve. She sat back down, pulled the small side table between them, and reached out. Give me your arm, she said. He gave her his arm. She began unwrapping the old bandage, slowly, careful not to disturb the wound more than necessary. He watched her face while she worked. She wasn't watching his face. She was watching his arm, her attention fully on what she was doing, on doing it right. She was very good at this. He noticed that in the clear-eyed way you notice things when you're too spent to filter. Her hands were sure and unhurried. She worked the salve into the wound edges with her thumb in a way that was firm, but didn't hurt more than it had to. She cut the fresh bandaging with scissors from the tin and wrapped it with the even tension of someone who'd either been taught well or had learned from enough necessity to figure it out. When she was done, she set his arm back on the chair arm with both hands, supporting it until it was settled. He looked at the new bandage, white and clean and properly done. Why did you do it? He asked. He meant the road. He meant all of it. But he also meant this, the broth, the lancing, the clean bandage. He genuinely wanted to understand the math of it, because his math kept not adding up. She gathered the old bandaging and stood. Because letting someone suffer who is already defeated doesn't make me stronger, she said. It just makes me smaller. And I've been small enough for long enough. She took the old bandaging to the rubbish pail by the back door. Josiah sat with the clean arm and the dying fingers and the broth cooling in his left hand, and he thought about that. He thought about the women he'd known in his life, the ones who'd shrunk in doorways, the ones who'd shouted, the ones who'd cried. He thought about how he'd categorized Abby Preston from the moment he'd read her letter of response to his advertisement. A woman with limited options would be a manageable woman. That was his logic. That was his calculation. He had wildly miscalculated. She came back to the chair. She didn't sit. She stood over him with her arms at her sides, and she said, Now you're going to tell us about Harlan, everything, who he's sending, how many, when they'd have left, and what route they'd take in winter. He looked up at her. "You're not in a position to negotiate, Josiah," she said. "You're in a position to be useful. So be useful." He glanced at Gideon. Gideon had put the awl down. He was sitting sideways on the work-table bench, arms loose, looking at Josiah with that flat, patient attention that Josiah was finding more unsettling the longer it went on. It wasn't threatening, exactly. It was just very present, like the man had nowhere else to be and nothing else to want, and could simply wait indefinitely for Josiah to do the sensible thing. Josiah drank the last of the broth. He started talking. He'd been Harlan Cross's accountant for 6 years. He knew the operation well, the mining revenue, the transport contracts, the side arrangements that didn't go in any official ledger, the men on payroll who did the work that other men were too principled to do. He'd skimmed slowly at first, small amounts, the kind that disappear into rounding errors, then larger. He'd had a plan, a year's worth of careful accumulation, then the advertisement for a mail-order bride, as cover for a man departing to start fresh, a woman who could play the role of innocent wife until the border. He didn't look at Abby when he said that part. She said nothing. She just stood there and listened. The gold was 3 months of skim consolidated. More than enough to live on for several years if a man was careful. Harlan had found the shortage in the books 2 weeks after Josiah had left Cheyenne. He'd found it fast because Harlan Cross was not a stupid man and had his own people checking the checkers, which was something Josiah had underestimated. Harlan would send 4 men minimum. He had a team he kept for exactly this kind of work recovery and resolution, as Harlan called it. They'd have left the valley within a week of the shortage discovery. In normal conditions, they'd have made the mountain approach in 3 days. The blizzard had slowed everything. But the blizzard was over now, and those men had good horses, and they knew this mountain. "How long?" Gideon asked. The first question he'd asked. Josiah considered. 2 days, maybe 3 if the upper pass is still blocked. Gideon nodded once. He looked at Abby. She was already looking at him. Some kind of communication happened between them that Josiah couldn't quite follow, a thing conducted in silence and brief eye contact that seemed to carry more information than a spoken conversation. It lasted only a few seconds, and then it was done. And Abby turned back to Josiah. "Rest," she said. "You're no good to anyone delirious." He didn't argue. He slept. When he woke, it was later. The light from the window had moved, and the cabin was quieter. He could hear Gideon outside. The sound of something physical and sustained, and he could hear Abby's voice, soft and sing-song, which meant she was talking to the baby. He lay still and stared at the ceiling and thought about the choices that had brought him to this chair, in this cabin, with this arm, and he thought about 6 years working for Harlan Cross and what that work had required of him, and he thought about a woman he'd put out of a wagon on a mountain road and how she was now the reason he still had any arm at all. The ceiling didn't offer him anything. Ceilings never did. He closed his eyes and let the willow bark tea Abby had left on the table beside him do its work. And he drifted, and the fire crackled, and outside the mountain held its cold and white silence. And somewhere down in the valley, 4 men with good horses were pointing themselves upward. The fever broke properly on Gideon on the 3rd morning after Josiah arrived. Abby knew it before he came down the ladder, because his breathing had changed in the night, settled into the long, even rhythm of real sleep rather than the quick, shallow work of a body fighting. She'd checked twice in the dark, standing at the base of the ladder and listening, and both times the sound from above was quiet and slow and right. He came down at first light, moving better than he had in days, still careful with the left shoulder, still a stiffness in how he turned his head. But the flush was gone from his face, and his eyes were clear. He looked at her. She was at the fire with Wyatt in her lap, feeding him mashed porridge off a small spoon. He looked at the poultice materials she'd left clean and laid out on the shelf, ready in case he needed another application. "Better," he said. "Good," she said. He went and made coffee. Josiah was awake in the chair, watching all of this from under heavy lids. He was better to less fever. The infection smell fading. The arm was still bad, but it was going the right direction. He was not going to die this week, which Abby had decided to consider a professional success, and nothing more. Gideon poured coffee and brought a cup to her without being asked. He looked at Wyatt, who had porridge on his chin and was deeply offended by this fact, and a brief, contained expression of amusement crossed Gideon's face before he turned away. She filed that away. It was a rare thing, that expression. She'd only seen versions of it twice before, both times involving Wyatt doing something ridiculous. It changed his face completely for the half-second it lasted, made him look younger and less like a man who'd spent 12 years having only himself for company. She wiped Wyatt's chin. He batted her hand away. "We need to talk about what's coming," Gideon said. He set his coffee on the table and stood by the fire. He wasn't looking at Josiah. He was looking at the wall above the hearth, at the stones his hands had set years ago, thinking. 4 men, armed. Harlan won't send anyone who'll be turned back easy. He won't come himself? Abby asked. Harlan doesn't do his own recovery work, Josiah said from the chair. His voice was hoarser than it had been the day before the infection, working on him in ways that weren't visible. He sends men. He stays in the valley and receives reports. Has he ever been turned back? Gideon asked. He was asking Josiah, still not looking at him, asking the wall. Josiah was quiet for a moment. No, Gideon picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down. Then this time will be the first, he said. He wasn't making a declaration, Abby noticed. He was just stating what he'd decided. The same way he stated everything plain and without inflection, a man reporting what was factually going to occur. She found that more convincing than a speech would have been. She settled Wyatt back in his crate with a piece of dried apple to work on and stood up. "I want you to teach me to shoot," she said. Gideon turned from the fire and looked at her. She met his eyes. The Winchester. "I've handled firearms before. My father kept a shotgun, and I know the principles, but I've never shot a rifle, and I intend to be useful if those men come up this mountain." Gideon studied her for a moment, not skeptically more the way he looked at everything before he acted, gathering information first. "The recoil is heavy," he said. "I'm aware of that." He looked at her broad shoulder, at the way she was standing, feet planted, weight centered, chin level. Reading her, she understood the way he'd read the road through the rains and the pass through the snow, assessing what was actually there, rather than what he assumed. He took the Winchester from the brackets above the door. Josiah watched from his chair with an expression that had moved from calculation through disbelief, and arrived somewhere at a kind of shell-shocked wonder. Though he said nothing, they went out to the porch. The morning was cold and sharp. The sky a clear, pale blue above the tree line. The snow in the yard was hard-crusted from last night's temperature drop, and it crunched under her boots. Gideon had set a round of firewood on the rail fence at the yard's far edge, 30 feet out, she guessed. He showed her the rifle. He didn't talk down to her, and he didn't over-explain. He showed her the action, how it loaded, how it cycled. He talked about the sight picture rear notch, front bead, target, eye, and he demonstrated the grip and the stance, and he held it out to her. She took it. It was heavier than she'd expected. Not unmanageable, but substantial. She felt the weight of it in her wrists and forearms, and she adjusted, settled her feet, pulled the stock into her right shoulder. "Higher," he said, "right in the pocket above the collarbone." She adjusted, the stock seated better. She looked down the barrel at the round of wood on the fence rail. "Breathe out," he said. "Squeeze on the exhale. Don't pull." She breathed in, breathed out, felt the exhale reach its natural end. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of it was enormous in the clear air. The recoil drove back into her shoulder, hard and fast, not painful exactly, but percussive, a full-body jolt. The round of wood on the fence rail exploded sideways, spinning off into the snow. The echo rolled back from the tree line. She lowered the rifle. Her shoulder was ringing faintly, her ears too, but her hands were steady, and she was upright, and her footing hadn't moved. She looked at the empty fence rail. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the fence rail. Then he looked at her. That same expression from the wagon. Surprise outpacing his face's ability to process it. But this time it stayed a beat longer. Again, she said. He cycled the action, showed her how to reload. She did it herself the second time, slower, getting the motion right. She planted her feet, settled the stock, breathed. She fired, another round of wood gone. Better this time she'd absorbed the first recoil, and her body had already adjusted, already built in the compensation. The second shot felt more like a choice, and less like a reaction. She fired 4 more times before they went back inside. By the fourth, she was hitting where she was looking, with the consistency that comes from understanding a thing well enough to stop thinking about every component separately. Her shoulder would be dark with bruising. By evening, she didn't care. When she came back through the cabin door with the rifle, Josiah stared at her like she was a different person than the one who'd gone out. She set the rifle on the table and looked at him. "You were going to tell Gideon more about Harlan," she said. "You started yesterday, and then you fell asleep. Keep going." Josiah pulled himself more upright in the chair. He was choosing cooperation fully. Now she could see it in his face, the particular settling of a man who has stopped looking for another angle and has simply decided to be straight. He told them about Harlan's operation in detail. The valley mining concern was legitimate on its surface. 4 active shafts, a processing facility, contracts with the Denver Rail. But underneath it ran a parallel economy, claim jumping on smaller operators who couldn't fight back. Protection arrangements that were indistinguishable from extortion. Transport contracts with rates that changed retroactively for operators who had no recourse. Harlan Cross had built himself into the valley's necessary man, the person through whom all commerce either flowed or was damned, and he'd done it by being absolutely consistent about consequences for people who tried to work around him. Gideon sat at the table and listened to all of this without expression. Abby watched his face while Josiah talked. She watched the jaw work once or twice on details that she guessed were new. Things Harlan had done in the 12 years since they'd last been in contact. She watched the stillness in his eyes that was not detachment but its opposite. A man feeling things deeply and choosing carefully how much of it showed. He'd left this. He'd walked away from whatever Harlan was becoming and climbed a mountain and built walls out of logs and lived inside them and let 12 years pass. And now 12 years of what Harlan had become was sending 4 armed men up the mountain. You can leave a thing, Abby thought. That doesn't mean it leaves you. The men he's sending, Gideon said when Josiah paused. Who leads them? Man named Decker, Josiah said. Cale Decker, ex-Army. He's been with Harlan 6 years. Is he smart? Smart enough to do the job, not inventive, meaning he'll follow a plan but won't adapt well if the plan breaks, Josiah considered. Yes, that's accurate. Gideon nodded slowly. He looked at Abby. She was sitting across from Josiah, with her hands folded on the table, and she looked back at Gideon. And again, that brief, silent exchange, she was learning to read it, or at least to read its edges. This one said, "We have something to work with." She gave a small nod. Gideon stood. He went to the window and looked out. The yard was quiet. The snow was bright. The tree line at the far edge was dark and still. 2 days, he said. Maybe less if the pass cleared fast. "What's your plan?" she asked. "Same as it's always been up here," he said. "Use the terrain. They won't know it. And I will." He turned from the window. "I'll need to set things in the trees. Lines, noisemakers, trip points. Take me most of tomorrow." "I'll manage the cabin," she said. "I know." She looked at the rifle on the table. She thought about the wooden target spinning off the fence rail. She thought about Wyatt in his crate by the fire, batting at the air, depending on the 2 adults in this cabin to still be standing when those men came up the trail. She thought about hiding in a cellar while Gideon dealt with what was coming alone, and then she stopped thinking about that because it wasn't happening. "I'm not going to be in the cellar," she said. Gideon looked at her. "When they come," she said, I'm not going to be hidden away. I'll be here. He held her gaze for a moment. I know that too, he said. There was no argument. No redirect, no discussion about safety. No quiet attempt to manage her into a position that fit what he thought she should want. He'd watched her throw her weight across a tipping wagon. He'd watched her drain a wound and set a poultice, and shoot a rifle on her first try, and then reload and do it again 5 more times. He knew what was in this room. He respected what he saw, and respecting it meant not hedging against it. She looked back at the fire, at Wyatt, reaching for the ceiling with both fists. What are you going to do with me? Josiah asked. He was looking at Gideon. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, genuinely uncertain, stripped of management. Gideon considered him for a long moment. You're not going anywhere on that arm, he said. So, the answer right now is nothing. You stay put and you stay quiet, and you don't make any choices that aren't yours to make. When this is over, we'll see. Josiah looked at Abby. She picked up the Winchester from the table and took it back to the brackets above the door and set it in place. She ran her thumb along the top of the receiver, feeling the cool metal. She didn't look at Josiah when she said, I'd listen to him. Josiah didn't say anything else. The afternoon went quiet. Gideon spread a hand-drawn map of the surrounding terrain on the work table and studied it in silence for a long time, making marks with a pencil in a way that was decisive and methodical. Abby fed Wyatt and put him down for his afternoon sleep, and then sat at the far end of the table and watched Gideon work and thought about all of it. She thought about who she'd been a week ago, lying in a frozen gully, scraping mud and flour off a rock with her bare fingers, waiting to see which came first, rescue or the cold. She thought about who she was now. The difference wasn't external. Nothing cosmetic had changed. She was the same large-framed, wide-shouldered, heavy-footed woman she'd always been. But she was sitting at a table in a solid cabin on a mountain she intended to defend, next to a man who looked at her and saw what was actually there, and she had a rifle she could shoot, and a child she intended to keep, and a version of herself she was not willing to put away again. Outside, the evening light turned the snow from white to gold. 2 days, maybe less. She looked at Gideon's hands on the map. Steady. Sure, the same hands that had hoisted her into a freight wagon and sanded the corners off a table and braced a rocking chair with iron brackets. She looked at her own hands, flat on the table in front of her. They looked like the same hands she'd always had. But they didn't feel that way. She turned them palms up and looked at them and decided that whatever came down from that valley, it was going to meet something it hadn't planned for. She closed her hands into fists. She opened them again. She was ready. The men came on the second day, just as the spring thaw was beginning. Not a dramatic thaw, just the first suggestion of it, the kind that comes in the late morning, when the sun angle changes, and you can hear the snow settling on the cabin roof. A faint, soft sound like the mountain exhaling. The icicles at the eave dripped for the first time in weeks. The air still bit, but it bit differently. There was something underneath the cold now, a loosening. Abby was at the window when she saw the first movement in the trees. She didn't call out. She just set Wyatt in his crate, picked up the Winchester from the table where she'd been keeping it close for 2 days, and said, Gideon. He was already up. He'd been sleeping light for 2 days straight, the way men sleep when they know something is coming, and their body refuses to fully let go of the watch. He was at the loft ladder and down it in seconds, boots on, rifle in hand. He came to the window and looked where she was looking. 4 shapes in the tree line, moving in spread pattern, not bunched. Decker was disciplined. She'd grant him that. They were coming in from 3 angles, which meant they'd scouted the terrain from a distance before approaching. They'd taken their time. 2 days of Gideon's preparation stood between those men and the cabin. She hoped it was enough. She believed it would be. Josiah, Gideon said without raising his voice. Josiah, who had been awake and sitting rigid in his chair since before dawn he'd known, somehow, with the animal awareness of a man whose survival depended on it, said, I see them. Get to the floor behind the woodpile and stay there. Josiah got to the floor behind the woodpile. Gideon moved to the far window, the one on the north wall with the narrow angle toward the approach trail. He watched for a moment, then turned to Abby. First line should take about 30 seconds. Listen for it. She listened. 20 seconds of silence. Then from the tree line to the east came a crash, something large falling. A trip line releasing a weighted log. Gideon had balanced in a pine and a shout, cut short. Then scrambling sounds. One man down. The other three would be repositioning now, trying to understand what they'd hit. One's out of it, Gideon said. He was reading it from the sounds, alone, eyes on the cabin's north side. The other three are moving wide to avoid the lines. They'll come to the open ground before the porch. Then we make them cross open ground, she said. He looked at her. She was at the south window, rifle up, looking out at the yard between the tree line and the cabin. 30 feet of hard-crusted snow with no cover. Those three men would have to cross it. East side, he said. I'll take west. She moved to the east window, cracked it an inch, settled the Winchester's barrel on the sill. The cold air cut in around the barrel. She breathed it in and breathed it out and found the sight picture and held it. The first man broke from the tree line at a run. She tracked him, let him get halfway across the yard. Let him commit, let there be no question about intent, and then she fired. The shot hit wide, kicking snow up 3 feet to his left. He went down anyway, not hit, but reacting, driving himself into snow and scrambling for the side of the cabin wall. She cycled the action, reloaded, tracked the place he'd dropped. From the west side of the cabin came 2 fast cracks from Gideon's rifle. A shout, then silence. She heard boots on the porch roof. She looked up. East corner, Gideon said sharply from across the cabin, and she understood one of them had made the porch roof and was moving toward the chimney, toward the angle where he could shoot down through the single window on that side. She was already crossing the room. She took the east corner window, flattened herself against the wall beside it, cracked it open an inch, and looked up through the narrow angle. She could see the edge of a boot on the roof's peak. She waited. The boot moved. The man shifted his weight to drop down to the chimney angle, and for half a second his knee was visible against the white sky. She fired through the window at the roof. The sound was enormous in the closed cabin. Wyatt shrieked from his crate. She felt it in her chest like a second shot, and then the sounds from the roof changed, scrambling, slipping, and then a body sliding down the pitched surface and dropping into the snowbank below the east eave. Not dead. She heard him moving, but off the roof and no longer elevated. Gideon's rifle fired twice more. She heard it from the west side, close and deliberate. Then a crack from outside, and she heard something she hadn't heard yet. Gideon's voice, short and involuntary, just a single compressed sound. Not a scream. The sound of someone absorbing something they didn't have the option to react to fully. She crossed the cabin. He was at the west window, still upright, still at the rifle, but his left hand had come off the forestock and was pressed against his right shoulder, dark at the fingers. Moving dark. He'd been hit. She didn't stop moving. She came to his side, looked out the west window. The man in that angle was behind a fence post, exposed at the hip. She raised the Winchester one-handed, resting the barrel on the windowsill, and fired. The man went down. The yard went quiet. Not completely quiet. There were sounds in the snow, men regrouping, moving in the trees, but the immediate pressure had broken. For 30 seconds, maybe less, nothing was advancing. She turned to Gideon. "Sit down," she said. "I'm standing. You're standing and bleeding." She put her free hand on his good arm. "Sit." 10 seconds. He sat on the low bench by the window. She looked at the shoulder. The coat was dark with blood at the upper right, soaking through the wool in a spreading circle. The bullet had gone through. She could see the exit tear in the back of the coat, which meant no digging, which was the good news. The bad news was that the shoulder was done for this fight. He couldn't hold the forestock with that hand, and he couldn't take a full recoil from a rifle on that side. He was looking at the window, already calculating. I can shoot left-handed from the west side, he said. Slow but accurate. I know where they'll come from. I've got the east and south, she said. Wyatt is in the crate, and the crate is behind the woodpile. He's all right. She looked. Wyatt was crying, big, indignant, terrified crying, but he was behind the stacked wood and below the window lines, and he was physically safe. She looked at him for 1 second. Just one? She let herself look, and then she turned back to the window, because that was what keeping him safe required. Gideon had already moved back to the west window, rifle canted in his left arm, elbow braced on the sill. His right arm was down and useless, and he was pale at the mouth, but his eyes were completely clear. She went to the south window. The man who'd gone off the roof was moving again. She could see him in the snow below the east eave, dragging himself toward the porch with his rifle still in hand. She tracked him, watched him get to the porch corner, and when he raised himself to look around the edge, she put a shot into the porch, post 6 inches from his face. He pulled back. From the west came Gideon's rifle, left-handed, slower than before, but still placed. A hit. She heard it in the particular way, sound changes, when a bullet finds what it was aimed at. She reloaded. Wyatt was still crying behind her, and the fire was still burning, and black smoke was starting to come from somewhere above her. She smelled it before she saw it. Something burning that wasn't the fireplace, and she looked up at the ceiling corner, to the right, where a thin, dark curl was seeping through the log join, the man on the roof. Before he fell, he'd done something to the corner. She looked at it and did her math fast. Small fire, caught in the exterior log, join where pine sap had collected, and the surface was dry from weeks of indoor heat. It would build slow at first. They had time, but not unlimited time. Corner's lit, she said. I know, Gideon said. He was still at the window. How long? He glanced up. 20 minutes before it's a problem. She looked at the south yard. The 2 remaining men outside the one below the eave, and one more she hadn't accounted for, were going to know. The fire was lit. They were going to know that all they had to do was wait. Make the people inside choose between the fire at their back and the guns at their front. That was Decker's adaptation. She'd thought he wasn't inventive, but he'd improvised fast. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at her. We pushed them out, she said. He held the look for a second. Then he gave one sharp nod. She went to the door, lifted the bar quietly, and cracked it an inch. The porch was empty. The man below the east eave had moved. She could hear him in the snow on the south side. She pulled the door open fast, stepped onto the porch in a low crouch, cleared the angles left and right. Clear. She came off the porch to the right, moving along the cabin wall toward the south side. The snow grabbed at her boots, soft on the top and crusted underneath, and she felt the uneven surface with each step but kept her balance, kept moving. She came around the corner. The man from the roof was there, 5 feet away in the snow, rifle half raised, looking toward the cabin door. He hadn't expected her from this side. There was a beat, both of them in it, both reading what was happening. She fired first. The shot took him in the arm and spun him sideways. The rifle went into the snow. He scrambled for it left-handed, and she crossed the distance in 3 strides and kicked it further away and put the barrel of the Winchester at his chest and said, "Stop." He stopped. He was young, late 20s, dark stubble, face gone white with pain and cold. He looked at the rifle barrel and then up at her, and he put both hands, the good one and the bloody one, up in the air. "Where's Decker?" she said. The young man's eyes went past her to the left. She dropped. The shot from behind her hit the cabin wall where her head had been, spraying bark and ice, and she rolled in the snow and came up with the Winchester and fired toward where the shot came from before she even fully saw him east of the cabin. Decker himself, broken from the tree line at last. The shot went wide, but it drove him behind the porch corner, and she was already moving again, circling away from him, putting distance between herself and the angle. From inside the cabin came a single shot from Gideon's rifle. Left-handed through the east window. It hit the porch post and sent splinters across Decker's position. He pulled back further. She had the angle on him now. He had the cabin corner on his left and open snow behind him, and she was in the south yard with a clear sight line to where he had to move. He stood up from behind the post. Not in surrender, he came up with the rifle shouldered, moving to his right to find a new angle. He was good. He was fast. He was also in open ground. She fired. The shot caught his right side, and he went down hard into the snow, rifle flying. He tried to rise. He made it to one knee. He looked at her across the yard, maybe 20 feet between them, and his face worked through several things at once. "It's over," she said. He was still on one knee. His right hand was going for the rifle in the snow. "Decker." Her voice came out flat and absolute. "It's over." He looked at her face, at the rifle, at the open snow around him and the cabin walls and the lack of anywhere else to go. He took his hand off his rifle. She stood in the snow with the Winchester and her bruised shoulder and the smell of wood smoke in her hair, and she looked at him until he sat down fully in the snow and stayed there. Behind her, the young man with the shot arm was sitting exactly where she'd left him. From inside the cabin, Abby. "Clear," she called back. A pause. "Come in and look at this corner," Gideon said. "The smoke's getting thick." She came in. The corner above the east wall was orange at the seam now, small flame visible in the log join, smoke rolling across the ceiling in a low, dark sheet. It took them 40 minutes, and every bucket of water and snow they could move to kill it. Gideon worked one-armed. Josiah, to his credit, came out from behind the woodpile and helped, his left hand working the snow bucket with what strength he had. The shoulder was black-scorched, and the log was going to need replacing in spring. But the cabin stood. When it was done, Abby stood in the yard with a bucket in her hand and looked at the smoke still trailing from the corner. Bright red in the churned snow at the east eave where the man with the shot arm had been sitting. More red at Decker's position, meltwater pink running in channels away from the cabin's base, black smoke against the blue spring sky. She set the bucket down. She went inside to her son. The afternoon went quiet in the hard way that afternoons go quiet after violence. Decker, and the young man, his name was Aldous, which seemed wrong for his face. Too formal for someone that young were secured in the horse shelter, with their wounds dressed and their weapons in the cabin. The man Gideon had taken down on the west side was alive and mobile. The one from the trip line in the trees had a broken collarbone and was sitting against a pine 60 yards out, looked at by Gideon on his way in, determined non-critical, and left there. Gideon's shoulder had been packed and bound. It would need real doctoring eventually, the kind that required a town and a physician. But Abby had done what she could: clean the entry and exit, packed both sides with the drawing salve, wrapped it tight. His right arm was in a sling she'd fashioned from a shirt. He was sitting at the work table with his left hand flat on the map, looking at nothing, resting in the way a man rests when he doesn't have the option of admitting how bad it is. Wyatt had cried himself into a deep, exhausted sleep. He was in his crate by the fire with his fists loose and his face slack, and he hadn't moved in an hour. She checked him every few minutes. He was fine. He'd been frightened, and now he was unconscious in the way of babies, who feel things enormously and then simply sleep them off. She envied that, briefly. Josiah was in his chair. He'd been quiet since the fire was out, the long, depleted quiet of a man who has helped a little with a crisis, and found himself surprised by his own willingness to do it. He was looking at his wrapped arm and the dark fingers and the middle distance, and she couldn't tell what he was calculating anymore. Maybe he'd stopped calculating. The cabin smelled of smoke and carbolic and the particular sharp metallic edge that lingers in a room after a gun has been fired indoors. The east corner was scorched black, and she'd have to think about what to do with the burned log before the next hard frost. But that was a problem for later. She fed the fire. She put water on for coffee. She sat down. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. The fire crackled. Wind moved in the eave. Wyatt breathed. Then from the horse shelter came a sound, a voice carrying across the yard. Decker's voice pitched loud enough to be heard through cabin walls. Then other sounds. Closer, inside. Abby was up before she identified what the sounds were exactly. Some deep running instinct, moving her faster than her reasoning, and she turned toward the woodpile where the gold sat in its leather bag and found Josiah not behind the woodpile anymore. He was across the room, at the crate. He had his left hand on Wyatt. He was lifting him. The world narrowed very fast. She understood the calculation. In the same second, she understood. The act Decker had called out, deliberately, loud enough to pull their attention to the horse shelter, loud enough to give Josiah his window. Josiah had watched this whole fight from behind a woodpile, and he had sat through the afternoon and figured out what he still had to offer Harlan Cross, what bargaining chip remained to him even with a dead arm and no horse, and 4 days of bad infection in his veins. A baby, Harlan's accountant, a bag of gold, and a baby. She crossed the room. She didn't think about it. Her body simply went. She grabbed Josiah by the front of his coat with both hands, all her weight dropping and driving through her arms, and she threw him sideways. He went harder than she intended, harder than she'd known she could, and he hit the side wall and went down, and Wyatt dropped back into the crate, screaming, and she put herself between Josiah and the crate, and she stood there. Josiah was on the floor. His infected arm had taken the impact, and his face was gray with the pain of it. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. Wyatt was screaming behind her, alive and screaming and unhurt. She heard Gideon move. He was on his feet, pistol in his left hand. She hadn't known he had a pistol on him, and he was looking past her at Josiah. His face was completely controlled and completely cold. She was breathing hard. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the pure release of the adrenaline, the body doing its accounting after the act. Josiah on the floor was a different thing than Josiah in the chair. The chair had given him a frame, a structure, something that let him hold himself as a person with agency in the situation. The floor stripped all that. He was just a sick, defeated, frightened man lying on the floorboards with his ruined arm and his dark fingers and the stolen gold 5 feet away that had bought him nothing. She saw the moment he fully understood what he'd just done and what it had cost him. She saw it in his face, not remorse exactly, more the dawning recognition that there was no more road. Every path forward he'd identified had just closed at once. He started to speak. She waited to hear what he'd reach for. He didn't reach for anything. He just said quietly, "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said. She stepped back to Wyatt. She picked him up and pressed him against her chest, and he grabbed her collar with both fists and screamed into her shoulder, and she stood there and held him and let him scream. He needed to. She let him. Gideon was still watching Josiah. His aim hadn't changed. Josiah looked at the pistol. He looked at the floor. Then he did something Abby had not seen him do. Once in the 6 weeks she'd known him in Cheyenne, or the days in this cabin, he stopped performing entirely. The management and the calculation and the angling just quit. His face went plain and old and tired. "Do what you have to," he said. Gideon looked at him for another long moment. Then he lowered the pistol. The back door crashed inward. Harlan Cross came through it. She understood immediately that she'd been wrong about one thing. Harlan did come himself, or he'd come this time, because this time it was different. This time it was personal, in a way the gold alone didn't explain. This time it was 12 years of a half-brother who never came back and never answered and never capitulated, and Harlan had decided that was ending today. He was older than Gideon and larger, the kind of largeness that comes from prosperity and power rather than work, but substantial. He had a revolver up, and he was looking at Gideon, and he wasn't looking at anything else. "Gideon," he said. His voice was remarkable, big and warm. The voice of a man who'd built a fortune, partly on its persuasiveness. "You look bad, Harlan." Gideon's voice had no performance in it, just the word. Harlan's eyes moved around the room. He clocked Josiah on the floor. the bag of gold, Abby with the baby. He put it together fast. This doesn't have to go bad, Harlan said. He was still pointing at Gideon, still only looking at Gideon. You give me Josiah and the gold and I walk out of here and this mountain stays yours. Same as always. Nobody else has to. Josiah moved. He had more left in him than his appearance suggested, or maybe desperation ran deeper than infection. He came off the floor with his left arm, reaching for Wyatt, reaching for the last card, and he got his hand on Abby's sleeve, and Wyatt let out a sound that wasn't a cry anymore. It was something rawer and older, and it went through her like a current. She'd already transferred Wyatt to her left arm when she moved. Her right hand found the handle of the skinning knife on the work table. 3 feet away, she'd watched Gideon use it for days. She knew exactly where it lived, and she turned and had it at Josiah's throat before she fully decided to do it. He went absolutely still. Harlan Cross looked at her for the first time. She looked back at him. She was aware in this moment of her size, the way she was rarely fully aware of it, not as a failing, but as a physical fact. She was large, and she was solid, and she was furious in the particular, focused way of a mother, whose child has just been grabbed for the second time by the same pair of hands. She filled the space between Harlan and Wyatt entirely. There was no angle he had at her son that didn't go through her first. Harlan's revolver was still on Gideon. Gideon's pistol was on Harlan. The room held. Josiah, very carefully, lowered himself back toward the floor. Harlan looked at Gideon. Stand down, he said, meaning the pistol. Put yours away first, Gideon said. You're injured. You can't. Gideon fired. Not at Harlan, at the post on the left side of the back door that Harlan had come through. The shot hit dead center, 6 inches from Harlan's head, and the sound in the closed cabin was enormous. Harlan went still. I've been shooting left-handed since I was 8 years old, Gideon said. His voice was perfectly even. The shoulder doesn't change that. Harlan looked at him, really looked. 12 years of distance. Whatever story each of them had built about the other across that gap, burning off in about 3 seconds. He put the revolver down. Abby fired. She'd moved Wyatt back to her left arm when Josiah dropped toward the floor. Her right hand had the Winchester she'd grabbed from the table. It had been there the whole time. She'd put it there herself when she came back inside, exactly where she could reach it. She'd watched Harlan come through the door, and she'd seen his body shift, seen the moment he decided, and she'd already had the rifle up when he moved. The shot took him in the chest. He went down. The room was very loud, and then very quiet. Abby stood with the rifle and the baby in smoke coming from the barrel of the Winchester, and she looked at Harlan Cross on the floor, and she breathed. He was done. She could see it from here. Josiah, on the floor beside the work table, had torn his dressings in the struggle, and blood was moving through the bandage in a dark, spreading tide. He was looking at his arm. He put his good hand over the bandage and pressed and looked at the ceiling, and his lips moved without making sound. His wounds opened, and he bled. Gideon crossed the room to Abby. He stood beside her, pistol down, and he looked at Harlan on the floor and at Josiah and at the bag of gold lying where it had always been, and he said nothing. She was still breathing, hard. Wyatt was quiet against her chest, pressed into her collar, one fist in her hair. It's over, she said, not to Gideon particularly, just to the room, to the facts of it. Yes, he said. She looked at Josiah. He was still looking at the ceiling. His lips had stopped moving. His hand was still on the bandage. He was still breathing when she looked. Then she looked at the blood, moving through the cloth, at the spread of it, at the rate. She looked at Gideon. He gave the smallest shake of his head. She looked down at Wyatt. He turned his face to look up at her wet-eyed, messy, completely calm in the way he got after the crying ran out, looking at her face to determine what the situation was. She smoothed his hair back. It's all right, she told him. It's over. The fire burned. The smoke drifted from the corner. The afternoon light came through the west window and lay in a long gold bar across the floorboards, bright and still and perfectly clean. Spring came to the mountain, the way spring always comes after a hard winter. Not kindly, not all at once, but with a kind of grinding persistence that eventually wins, simply because it has no intention of stopping. The snow pulled back from the southern slopes first, revealing ground that was dark and wet, and smelling of pine duff and cold soil, the smell of things that had been waiting under the ice for months, ready to begin. The elk came back down from the high timber. The creek at the north edge of Gideon's land broke open with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot across the valley below, and then ran white and loud over the stones. Wyatt, who had spent the whole winter looking at a world that was one color, became deeply interested in mud. He was pulling himself upright now, getting a fist on the porch rail and standing on his own steam. 8 months old and determined about it in the focused, wordless way he was determined about everything. He pulled up, stood, looked at the yard, looked at the mud, looked at Abby as if to confirm she was seeing this too, and then sat back down and crawled toward the steps with clear intent. No, she said. He looked at her. The mud will keep, she said. He looked at her. He sat down in the middle of the porch and put his fists on his knees and accepted this, temporarily, in the manner of someone reserving judgment. Gideon was in the yard. He was saddling the bay mare, not the draft horses, the riding horse he kept for supply runs, and the occasional trip down to the nearest trading post. He was moving careful with the right shoulder, which had healed well enough, but would never be exactly what it was before. He'd told her that plainly, the way he told her most things. It'll work, just not the same. That was the whole of his complaint about it. She watched him saddle the horse. He'd ridden to the valley twice since the fight. The first time to report what had happened to Marshall at the nearest settlement. The Martin had ridden up with a deputy and taken statements and looked at the evidence and concluded, with the weariness of a man who had dealt with Harlan Cross's operation before, and was not sorry to be dealing with its aftermath, that the matter was straightforward. Josiah's gold had been restored to the mining company's ledger. The surviving men, Decker, Aldous, the one from the trees, had been taken down the mountain in custody. Harlan Cross and Josiah Blackwood were in the mountain ground, in a plot at the cabin's east edge that Gideon had dug in the thaw. It was the decent thing. She hadn't argued with it. You didn't have to grieve someone to believe they deserved ground. The second valley trip had been about the horse and the packs, and business she didn't know the details of. This third trip she knew about. Gideon had told her the night before, plain and direct, sitting across the fire from her while Wyatt slept. Pass was fully clear. The trading post was open. He was going down for supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil, the things they'd burned through over a hard winter, plus a fight. He'd said, sitting across the fire, "The pass is clear all the way to the Cheyenne Junction. I'll bring back what we need. You could write a letter ahead, arrange a coach. You'd be in Cheyenne before the real heat of summer." She'd looked at him. He'd kept his eyes on the fire, his face doing what it did, that flat, careful stillness that she now knew, after weeks of proximity, was not detachment, but the opposite. It was a man keeping himself very controlled about something he cared about the answer to. She'd said, "I'll think on it." She'd thought on it all night. Now she was on the porch with Wyatt and the mud, watching Gideon check the cinch on the bay mare. And she was thinking about it still. She'd thought about Cheyenne. She'd thought about the eastern cities she'd never been to, but had read about in the essays from Gideon's loft shelf. She'd thought about propriety and society, and the particular way that the world outside this mountain arranged its judgments and made them known. She'd thought about chairs and doorways and tables without sanded corners. She'd thought about the flour sack in the gully, about the long streak of blood in the snow, about a wagon tipping over a cliff edge in a blizzard, and the weight of her own body being the thing that saved it. She'd thought about a reinforced chair and a full bowl, and a man who looked at what was actually there. Gideon finished with the cinch and turned. He saw her standing at the top of the porch steps. He saw her face. He came across the yard slowly, leading the horse. his boots making the first marks in the soft mud of the morning. He stopped at the base of the steps. The horse blew steam in the cool air and shifted its weight and stilled again. Wyatt on the porch behind her made a sound of intense interest at the horse. Gideon looked at Abby. She looked at the saddlebags on the mare. Then at the saddlebags specifically, she'd been watching him pack them this morning, and she'd noted what wasn't in them. He hadn't packed anything of hers. He hadn't packed the bag with her name on the tag, the one from Josiah's wagon that Gideon had brought in from the cold on the first night. He hadn't packed Wyatt's things. He'd let choice to her. She turned back to the cabin. She went inside. She crossed to the corner of the room where the leather drawstring bag sat on the high shelf, where it had sat since the night she'd found it in Josiah's coat. Heavy with the gold, Josiah had skimmed. The gold the marshal had confirmed, after accounting for the restored mining ledger, exceeded what had been stolen. Josiah had been more successful in his skimming than even Harlan had known, and the surplus belonged, legally, to whoever possessed it. That was her. She took it from the shelf. She walked back to the porch. She went down the steps. She crossed the yard to where Gideon stood with the horse, and she stopped in front of him. And she looked at the bag in her hands. She dropped it. The bag hit the mud with a heavy, solid thud and sat there, dark leather against dark earth. She stepped forward. She raised her hand and laid it flat against his chest. His heartbeat was there, slow and steady, the same steadiness that was in everything he did. She felt it against her palm. He looked at her hand, then at her face. She said, "I spent half my life shrinking myself to fit into a world that hated me. I'm not going back." She held his gaze. "Here, I am your equal, Gideon. I am your counterbalance. And this is my home." He was very still. She felt his heartbeat under her palm. And she stood in the mud and the spring light, and she held his eyes, and she didn't look away, and she didn't qualify it, and she didn't shrink it. He lifted his left hand, the good one, the steady one, and covered her hand where it was on his chest. Just covered it. His fingers closed around hers, and he held them there. His face changed. She'd seen the version of it twice before. Once, when Wyatt did something ridiculous with a spoon. Once in the wagon on the cliff edge when surprise outpaced him. This was different. This was slower. It started at the eyes and moved outward, and it pulled at the scar along his jaw in a way that should have looked strange but didn't, because the scar was part of the face, and the face was fully his. He smiled. It was a rare thing. A real thing. It stretched the scar and crinkled the corners of his eyes and changed the whole geometry of him for the few seconds it lasted, and it was worth the whole winter to see it. "All right," he said. Quiet. Just the one word. Behind them on the porch, Wyatt had gotten a grip on the porch rail and hauled himself upright. He stood there on 8-month legs, both fists gripping the rail, looking out at the yard and the mountains and the mud and the two people in it, his face wearing the perfectly serious expression he brought to every new discovery. The bay mare blew steam. The creek ran loud over the stones at the north edge of the property. The snow on the high peaks was still white, but the slope below were dark and green coming in at the edges, spring making its slow, inevitable argument. Abby turned. She looked at the cabin, the logs, black at the east corner, but sound, the porch she'd walked 100 times, the window that looked out over the yard, where the snow had first begun to thin, the heavy door on its iron hinges, the wolfhounds sleeping in a beam of morning sun on the porch boards, two big pale shapes, loose-limbed and easy. She thought about all the spaces she'd tried to make herself smaller to fit, all the rooms she'd entered sideways, all the silences she'd kept to avoid taking up too much air. She thought about the first morning here, eating one careful spoonful of porridge, managing herself out of pure habit, and a man who'd refilled the bowl without ceremony and told her to eat. She turned back to the mountain, to the pine timber and the creek sound and the sky above the peaks, going from pale blue to a deeper, warmer blue as the morning moved. She was not going back. She was here, on her own weight, in a solid place, with her son on the porch, and her hand warm under Gideon's, and the ground firm beneath her feet. The mud was going to be a problem when Wyatt got down those steps. That was tomorrow's problem. Today's problem was standing right here, and it was no problem at all. Gideon kept her hand. He turned to stand beside her, facing the same direction, looking out at what was his and now hers. Two people on a mountain. No excess. Nothing decorative. Just what was real, and what was solid, and what had been tested under the worst conditions the season could manufacture, and had held. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Abby Preston didn't become someone new at the end of this story. That's the part worth sitting with. She didn't lose weight. She didn't transform into a smaller, more acceptable version of herself to earn love or safety or a place to belong. She stood in the mud of a Rocky Mountain spring, dropped a bag of gold at her feet, and told a man exactly who she was and what she intended. And the man looked back at her the same way he'd been looking at her since the moment he pulled her out of that gully, and said, "All right." Not because she'd proven herself worthy. She'd been worthy the whole time. That's what this story is really about. Not romance, not survival, not even the frontier. It's about the long, exhausting work of unlearning the lie that your worth is determined by how little space you take up. Abby spent years making herself smaller, eating less, sitting careful, entering rooms sideways, staying quiet so nobody would have to notice how much of her there was. She did it so automatically, she almost didn't recognize herself doing it anymore. And the world around her called that humility, called it politeness, called it the right way for a woman like her to move through life. Gideon Cross never asked her to do any of that, not once. He reinforced the chair before she sat in it. He filled the bowl before she could ask for less. He sanded the corners off the table, not because she complained, but because he saw what was there and responded to it. He didn't see a burden. He saw a person, and in seeing her clearly, he gave her something no one had offered her in a very long time, the permission to take up exactly as much space as she actually needed. There's a lesson in that for all of us, not just for people who have been told they are too much too large, too loud, too emotional, too difficult, too expensive to keep around, but for the people in their lives too. Because the way Gideon loved Abby wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a bowl of porridge filled to the top. It was iron brackets on a rocking chair. It was sandpaper on the corners of a table and a stool placed without being asked. It was small, consistent, practical acts that said, "You are here, and you deserve to be comfortable here, and I am going to make sure this place fits you rather than asking you to fit it." That's what real care looks like, not grand gestures, not speeches, just a person paying attention and then doing the thing that attention calls for. And Abby's humanity, the choice to treat Josiah's wounds even after everything he did, to refuse to let his cruelty make her cruel in return. That wasn't weakness. It wasn't forgiveness either, not really. It was something harder and more deliberate than both. It was the decision to remain whole in a situation designed to break her, to not let what was done to her determine what she was capable of doing. She didn't save Josiah because he deserved it. She said so plainly. She saved him because she deserved to keep her hands clean, because her dignity wasn't his to take, even when he tried. That distinction matters. There's a difference between forgiving someone who wronged you and simply refusing to let their wrong define you. Abby drew that line and held it. And that choice, more than anything else in this story, is what made her the person standing on that porch at the end, solid and unbroken and entirely herself. The frontier in this story isn't just geography. It's the edge of what a person can survive and still come back from with something intact. Abby crossed that edge and came back with more than she started with, not because the mountain was kind, but because she refused to put down the parts of herself that other people told her were too heavy to carry. She carried them anyway, all the way to solid ground. Whatever you're carrying, Right now, whatever someone has told you is too much, too inconvenient, too difficult to accommodate. I hope this story reminded you that the right place and the right people won't ask you to put it down. They'll build something stronger to hold it. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. The themes explored, including body image, domestic hardship, and frontier survival, are presented in a narrative context and are not intended as medical, psychological, or professional advice of any kind. Viewer